Hello everyone and welcome back to the Matillion Meets Podcast. Once again, I'm super excited to announce our next guest. We are joined by Meng, who is our Senior Director of our engineering organisation. Welcome, Meng, to the Matillion Meets Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Mira. It's been a pleasure for me to be able to make it today and really happy to be here.
Great. There's some really exciting things we're going to talk about. Obviously, you've been leading the engineering org in developing the data productivity cloud, so there's lots to talk about there. But another thing I want to talk about is the fact that you're one of our very first female engineering leaders within Matillion. So that's a great honour and a great responsibility as well. But I can't imagine what it would be like to walk into a company and know that you're the only or one of the only female leaders in that team. What was that like for you coming into Matillion last year?
Having been in this position before, it is not exactly, an unfamiliar ground for me. Mm-hmm. It's something that I've been through in the past where I've walked in and, it's essentially there are a lot of men in the room and very few women who are actually in the engineering team. So this is actually something that I've been through before in the past. But coming from Expedia, where there's a little bit more balance in terms of from the diversity angle, from all accounts, it was definitely another sort of like, okay, think about the company, where they come from, and think about, the sort of like culture and the makeup of the company, and how do I sort of bring, myself onto the table as well to basically give some insights of different ways of working in terms of where I can contribute, but also understanding the heart of the company and where they came from as well. So it's a bit of a two-way understanding sort of thing in terms of how do we sort of, move the company forward, but at the same time not lose the heart that it is.
No, I love that. That's a great take. So did you think that you kind of fit into the puzzle quite nicely then when you first joined us?
I would say not so much as fit, because I prefer to use the word add.
Yeah.
Because there's a shift in terms of us moving from the word culture fit in terms of cultural add. And, everybody brings something of themselves to the table, not necessarily someone who, is exactly like people who are already there. But you're bringing new ideas, you're bringing a bit of yourself, you're bringing in, something different.
Yeah.
And hopefully all that adds up in terms of us being able to create a product that's really innovative, that is really out there, and that really challenges the market. And that's what we want, is for people to bring in their experiences to the table.
No, I love that. That's a great way of looking at it. And I also can't imagine, so I don't know about you, but when I was at school, being a woman in STEM or the kind of computer science aspect of things or the sciences weren't really like drilled into me when I was younger. So did you always know that you wanted to be an engineer, or was that something you kind of learnt while you were at school? Like, how did that come about?
I think being the youngest daughter in the family, I was a little bit of a rebel in that sense. Ironically, my parents actually thought that I would do better as an accountant than in engineering. But there was a bit of a strange sort of like irony, because I actually suspected my dad actually wanted boys. He wanted sons, and instead he had me and my sister, two girls. But that didn't stop him from actually getting, computers. He was very into science fiction. So he was very much, into technology in that sense. And he was very encouraging in terms of, getting us books about science, about, nature and things like that, getting us into museums and, the exposure really more so than anything else. And so I was very young when my dad actually came back with an Apple computer, which was my very first computer. And I remember doing the Apple programming for kids, where you had to basically ask a person, what sort of pizza do you want, what sort of topping do you want, and then in the end you sort of go like, oh, this is the pizza you wanted, you ordered, and this is how much it would cost, because every topping costs a certain amount. So in an ironic way, because I think my dad he wasn't inhibited with the perception of what me and my sister should be exposed to.
Yeah.
So that kind of helped in terms of giving me that sort of backing and that sort of exposure of computers. My sister was the one that actually, went on to finance. I'm the one that actually went on to science. But it was like little things where my favorite subject was maths. I was always doing a lot of logic puzzles, jigsaw puzzles, chess, so it was definitely geared towards these sort of like engineering challenges from the get-go.
So your career kind of started off with being a coder, and then obviously now you are in a formal leadership role. What was that jump like for you?
So that was kind of interesting because I actually would have been in a leadership role a lot earlier in my career if I really wanted to, if I really pushed for it. But I enjoyed coding far too much for quite a period of time. So I was in this job where I was doing producing software for the radio industry with the likes of BBC and Biomedia. And I had a lot of really interesting problems to solve, like, trying to create search indexes for customers so that they can then drive their search results a certain way. And also trying to build trending algorithms in terms of what radio show could be trending right now, building API calls where the APIs would go down when One Direction comes onto the radio, things like that. And so there was a lot of learning. There was a lot of good exposure from that role. It was very limited in one sense because we didn't have a lot of money to deal with scale, to deal with a lot of the challenges that I eventually learned to deal with in Expedia. But it was a good learning ground, and I really enjoyed it. And I was like, I should make the most of the time there in terms of taking the time to sort of learn good engineering practices, get the exposure I want. But eventually, towards the end of that role, which was almost 9 years in, I got to the point where I was feeling like, I'm probably getting into that position where I'm more effective as a people leader than as an engineer. And that I was starting to really enjoy watching others grow and watching others actually nail it in terms of like delivery and getting the wins rather than me as an individual. And that's when it sort of like clicked to me that, I want to build teams. I want to build my team. And I enjoyed building my team in that role because I had the handle of like interviewing and getting my peers in. And then eventually, right towards the end, I was leading them for the final year. So that's when the realization sort of kicked in.
I love that. And I can imagine it's quite daunting for anyone to go into a leadership role, but probably more so women, because I think we more often than not find men in leadership positions. And the narrative we often hear is about how there's often a kind of a power struggle between men and women in finding their ground within like a leadership role. How did you navigate that kind of earlier on when you first became a leader versus now when you're a senior director? How has that kind of changed throughout your career?
What was interesting was that when I was working in Asia, it was very much of an even split in terms of women in engineering.
Okay.
Because in Asia, that was where all the jobs were. And so naturally, a lot of people were taking up computer science degrees. And so they were going into computing and programming in general. So when I was working there, it was like a more even split of like, not quite 50-50, but maybe 40-60s. And there were women in leadership roles there that I learned a lot from. But coming to the UK, it was pretty much the opposite end of the spectrum, which was a bit of a surprise for me in some sense. But that first job that I had in the UK, there was another women engineer on the ground. And there was a bit of a friction going on between the two of us because I was a newbie. I was a new person in the picture, but I was also very hungry for basically learning and for basically trying to solve challenges and things like that. And she definitely felt that sort of competition in a way. So there's a bit of that female competitiveness going on there. But the thing is that what I've learned from that experience going forward is that because there's so few women in this area, we need to be allies for each other.
Yeah.
And so it's important to sort of build that relationship because we have the same understanding in terms of, challenges, backgrounds, similar sort of scenarios that we've all gone through in terms of, thinking, am I being too aggressive if I say this, in this meeting? Or am I being too meek am I not being assertive enough? That sort of thing about finding your balance and trying to find what's the right behavior to exhibit in some of these leadership sessions sometimes. Because for men, on the other hand, there's that sort of like stereotype towards, the macho-ness in terms of, the bravado and the confidence sort of feel that you get from someone who makes a big statement and puts it out there. And when a woman does it, sometimes you get that reaction where some people go like, oh, she's being quite aggressive, or, she's being bold, but not necessarily in a positive way as well. So, it becomes a challenge of basically staying true to yourself and making sure that you're basically staying true to your values of what you want to exhibit in terms of, ignoring the types, ignoring everything else. Essentially, everyone has, good intent in terms of what they want to push in terms of ideas or, opinions and things like that. But it's always a difficult one in terms of, you need to get your voice, at the table, because if you don't have your voice out there, you'll never get a seat at the table. And I think that's the challenge for a lot of women in leadership, is trying to figure out, like, how do you get that voice out there?
Yeah, it's interesting to say that as well, because I think even though I'm a woman, if I get a message from a woman which has, like, without exclamation points, without a smiley face, sometimes I think, oh, they're being a bit harsh. And I'm like, I would never think that if a man sent that to me. So it's kind of like acknowledging that difference and not feeling ashamed to kind of basically treat other people, speak to other people the same way men in leadership would do to us. I think we kind of have that kind of guilt of saying that you have to be extra nice and be extra polite, but that wouldn't be the same on the other shoe.
It's interesting that you say that, because I always say this about, when you read a message on Slack, for example, or a text message, people tend to put a voice to, the sentence. And actually, the voice you put to that sentence might not be the same as how the person intended it to be said.
Exactly.
So, it's exactly as you say, right? If you don't put the smiley face, and then people go like, oh, wow, okay, she's probably being a bit full on, or, something like that. Or, same with like a man as well, in terms of the sort of stereotypes that we tend to portray with, a man's voice.
Exactly.
And the reality is that, it could be something entirely different.
Yeah. So I guess that kind of goes nicely on to my next question, which is what your opinion is of the biggest challenges and assumptions women in leadership face today.
So I think a lot of it comes back to the cycles of a women's career, right? In terms of, if you choose to have children, then you have to take time off, to basically accommodate the pregnancy. You may take different life choices beyond that, or you may still want your career to carry on. And I think that's the sort of like perception about the availability of a woman, and at a certain point of time in her life, in terms of whether is she still committed in her career, or maybe it's the husband that needs to be the one that becomes the breadwinner. And I think it was kind of interesting, because a couple of years ago I had an engineer come to me, Matt was his name, and his partner had a baby, and she had taken a year's maternity leave off. But a year later, Matt came to me and said, like, oh, I want to go down to a 4-day week if that's possible, because I want to support my partner going back to the workplace. And I thought it was kind of interesting, because I've never been approached with this sort of question before. But at the same time, I was also thinking, okay, that's fantastic, because here is a man who is willingly supporting his partner to go return back to the workplace, which is, I think, really amazing, and something that we're starting to see more of, actually, of late. And so that's been really good. It's not assuming that, the woman doesn't care about her career beyond a certain point. It's not true. Some women do still care about the career. They still want to see that continuity. They still want to have that ambition and that success. And so I think that's one of the challenges and assumptions that we're still sort of working our way through in terms of the society as it stands.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's obvious that we've come a long way, but there's still so much further to go. And I guess that's some part of what makes a great leader, is being understanding about those situations and supporting your direct reports through those situations. What, in your opinion, is the one thing that, not the one thing, but the biggest thing that makes a great leader?
I think it's having the humility to acknowledge that we are always learning.
Yeah.
There's always room for growth. There's always room for feedback, no matter what level you are. And I think as a leader, you sort of recognize that, you're not the person who knows all necessarily. Sometimes your team knows more than you, and you get to a point where actually, technically, your team probably does know more than you as well, and you have to use whatever information they give you to sort of figure out, like, does this make sense to me? Okay, does this actually come together in that way? But it is actually, just acknowledging that you're always learning, and just having the appetite for just continuously building up your knowledge and learning something new every day, and trying to basically, understand if there are certain behaviors about yourself that you might want to improve or fix or change, anything like that. And I think that's what a good leader should be, is someone who doesn't stay, satisfied with who they are as they stand, as a status quo.
Yeah.
They know that the world keeps moving, and you learn new information and you keep adapting. And part of the challenge of, a lot of us in the leadership space is that you constantly have to help your team deal with changes as well, and being agile towards change. Because the reality is that, we've had things like the pandemic happen, we had the situation with the recent war happen as well. And, that's had massive impacts in terms of the economy and everything else. So, you learn new information, and then you have to basically adapt. And part of our sort of work as a leader is also helping our team to understand why we're doing something, for what reason, what's the value it brings, and things like that. And so it's getting that message out there to them.
So obviously we've spoken a lot about your experience as a female leader, and obviously it's a well-known thing that diversity is super important within everything in life, but especially here at work. How are you approaching increasing the diversity within our engineering org?
So diversity is a challenge, definitely, for Matillion, because we acknowledge where we are today in terms of our diversity numbers, but we also have a target in terms of how we want to improve and move the needle towards that. And if you look at how we've hired in, for example, placement students in previous years, the last cohort that we had, all the engineering placement students were all men. And we acknowledge that something's got to change here, because obviously something is off in terms of how did we land with basically all the engineering placement students being men. How can we sort of change that process in terms of making it more inclusive for women, but also how do we source sort of women candidates who are working within the STEM fields, and giving them that opportunity within our engineering team. And Leanne, who heads up our early careers side of things, has done a great job with sourcing. She worked very hard in terms of understanding, what did we not do in the previous year? What could we change about how we do things in terms of getting more diverse candidates through the system? Because the one thing we also do not want to do is lower the bar either, in terms of, basically not bringing in the best candidates into the picture. We always want to have the best person for the job that we have, but we want to improve, the sort of like sourcing, so that we can then enlarge that pool further. And I'm really delighted that for the next year's cohort, we've managed to achieve 50% of the split in terms of men and women or placement students. And I think that's really amazing, because we put in the legwork there in terms of improving how we interview, improving how we're assessing early career students, and improving how we make ourselves more inclusive and more appealing to a more diverse set of candidates. And, that's also just beyond just men and women as well, because when you look at interview processes, they are definitely more partial towards people who are extroverts, who actually present themselves well, who communicate well. And it's harder for the person who is, a bit shy, more introverted, probably, gets nervous very easily. And I think a lot of it comes down to us sort of acknowledging that that doesn't mean that they're not going to be great at the job. You know, they might be more reserved, but you know, they have different qualities in terms of how they think, how they solve problems, and that isn't exactly clear from typical interview processes. So we want to sort of like look at our interview processes and also sort of ask ourselves in terms of like, how do we get those sort of signals in terms of, you know, this person's not just a good talker, but actually this person actually knows how to solve engineering problems, has the right sort of mindset and approach towards these sort of challenges. And that's what we want to sort of, we've been working hard at in terms of changing our hiring approach in terms of how we do assessments.
And of course, the R&D teams have been instrumental in making this development happen. Talk about what it's been like for, let's say in your case, the engineering team, building the Data Productivity Cloud.
It's been actually a really interesting challenge because we wanted to basically, you know, take a lot of the good parts of Metal, but also not just take the experience as it stands within Metal. We wanted to reimagine the experience and actually go, you know, what would make a better user experience. And so there's been a lot of dialogue between the engineering and the product teams, and that includes product design as well, being the heart of it in terms of the experience side, in redefining what the user journey should be within the Data Productivity Cloud, within the projects and the designer, and, you know, with the sort of like environment setup for the user, so that we actually look at the whole user journey and going like, you know, is this contributing to a phrase that our product team coined, 10 minutes to wow, essentially. And so, you know, how long does it take for a user to get set up? And so from the engineering perspective, we've been challenged from the perspective of like not actually being biased towards how we solve problems before in Metal, but actually looking at how we solve the problems in Metal and then just going, is there a better way? And I think this has been the thing that has pushed us all the way through from engineering in terms of, you know, the standards, in terms of basically defining our path forward, and actually looking at things not just from like a tactical decision perspective, but also from like a more strategic point of view.
Yeah.
Like right now we are targeting, you know, the sort of like the low code users. How do we then, you know, move towards enabling high code users, who's the other end of the spectrum that we want to look towards. And so, you know, one of my engineers is working on basically what we call the domain specific language, where we're trying to redefine the model of defining our pipelines and how they are basically being scripted out, so that it makes it easier for customers who might not want to use the designer but want to interact with the sort of code directly, and build their pipelines directly in the sort of like code format. And so there's a lot of things like this where we're looking at opportunities, not just from a short-term perspective, but we're also looking at a much longer term. And for our engineering teams, it's been quite exciting because I don't think they've had, you know, that much opportunity to have this much input before into the product. And so it's been very good for them to have that sort of exposure, to have that dialogue with product in terms of what would the next Matillion look like. Yeah.
So it's clear that you've built a great team. But now that we've got that team, you kind of need to keep them at the top of their game. How do you and the rest of the team keep on top of emerging technologies and trends? How do you guys keep that development going?
It's always a challenge within an engineering team because people are always very attracted to the next shiny thing, essentially. And it's not so easy. It's not so straightforward in terms of like, oh, here, look at this new shiny thing here. That could be an interesting thing for us to use and adopt from a technology standpoint.
Yeah.
There's a lot of thought process that has to be put into it in terms of like, okay, if we bring this thing in, what's the investment we have to put into it? What is the value we're getting out of it? Does the value sort of outweighs the investment we're putting in? What's the cost of maintaining it? And so there's a lot of decision making that needs to be put in place. But it doesn't mean that we should stop looking at new technology either. We should always have an eye on what the industry trends are. And so there are things that actually, we try to bring attention to the engineering team too on a couple of regular white papers that get published, like the ThoughtWorks Tech Radar. And interestingly enough, there was something that was released in the ThoughtWorks Tech Radar last year that we've actually brought into the Data Productivity Cloud recently, in terms of one of the frameworks. And but we didn't just bring it in, straight away when we first saw it. We just saw it, thought about it, and thought, okay, this is interesting. Until we find a case for it, maybe we just park it for now. And actually, we found a really good use case for bringing in this framework in terms of managing state within the designer, in terms of doing the undo redo features that you normally do with these sort of applications. And so there's always room for innovation. There's always room for technology. And it's so important for us to keep an eye out on in terms of what's out there. And that's true either articles, either through, I always get books for my team as well in terms of the library, building up the library of books. Articles as well, and basically going like, hey, here's an interesting article, we might want to read about this and actually understand if there's something here that we want to take, make some use out of.
But the next big thing for Matillion is the Data Productivity Cloud. Obviously, it's all we've been hearing about, we're talking about a lot, but why is it that we're building the Data Productivity Cloud? What is that really going to offer our customers?
So one of the things that we tend to struggle with our existing product as it stands is basically selling to people who just want to get to the core aspects of a product straight away, in terms of designing the data pipelines, in terms of loading in data. And we've got certain fragments of products with data loading, with CDC, with our sort of connectors side of things. But what we don't have right now is how all these pieces connect together in terms of making a cohesive sort of product and ecosystem, and how they can sort of play with each other. And what we're getting to with Data Productivity Cloud is starting, to sort of bring all these pieces, all these fragments together, so that we then look at the product on a whole and going like, actually, okay, the customers maybe they want to use this aspect of the product and then join it up with this aspect of the product. How do we enable them to do that? And Data Productivity Cloud is, driving us towards that vision of allowing customers to plug in the pieces that they want out of Matillion and putting together onto, one single place in terms of defining their pipelines. And doing that with very little friction, with very little upfront work that they would need to do in terms of setup, in terms of installations or anything like that. So going towards that sort of idea of, well, don't worry about setting up environments. We solved that problem for you. Here, you can just get started straight away, as long as you want to use one of our Matillion hosted agents instead. And this is how you can get started straight away with building your data pipelines. You don't have to worry about setting up anything on your side. And so we want to take away a lot of the headaches and the overheads of maintenance in that sense.
Yeah, so we're basically helping data teams to get the most out of their data in a short space of time.
Exactly. So we're removing the need for them to have additional resources to maintain certain infrastructure or environments or anything like that. We're basically, removing the need for them to actually put in time as well to enable that. Because then the data teams can just get in there and then do what they want to and get their problem solved straight away. Because it's kind of like a bit like a chat GPT sort of world, isn't it? In terms of, I just want to put my data in there and then get this answer out there. That's all I want. Yeah.
And it's obviously super exciting. It's getting everyone in business talking. And we actually have some questions from other Matillioners in the business for you. So the first question is from Ben Milner. And his question is, are there any plans for migration capability for existing Metal customer to easily move to the Data Productivity Cloud?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we are doing as part of the work with we're defining the domain-specific language, or DSL as we call it, or the Matillion data pipeline language, essentially. It's basically enabling conversion of the existing metal formats to our new pipeline formats. And so by having that converter in place, we're hoping that we'll be able to get to the point where actually we can use these converters to enable customer migrations. Obviously, there will be some nuance cases where we'll need to actually understand and see, okay, do the pipelines still work when we do a migration? How do we manage that sort of process? How do we make sure that customers are supported through the migrations as well? We definitely have that on the cards. We definitely do want to do that. And we definitely do want the metal customers moving on to the new world in terms of the data property cloud.
Hopefully that answers your question, Ben. And this next question is from Kalyan. And he asks, what will MDL users' experience be when the Data Productivity Cloud is released? Will they see DPC UI or continue to see existing MDL 2.0 UI?
They will continue to see the existing MDL 2.0 UI for the time being. So that's going to be the next stage of how we bring MDL fully into the Data Productivity Cloud, because technically we do term data loading as part of the Data Productivity Cloud. But again, it's one of those fragments that's sitting on the side right now. But we need to figure out, how do we bring it in fully into enabling someone to go like, here's my data loading pipeline. Can I take the output of that data load and then, plug it into the rest of my transformation job and transformation pipeline or similar? And so it's not there yet in terms of us actually thinking about the whole end-to-end experience, but it's definitely on the table in terms of what we want to change from a user experience perspective. But from day one, no change whatsoever to MDL.
Okay, thank you. So those are all the questions from other Matillioners. I know there was a few other questions as well. We might be able to get those questions up on Slack at some point for you. But my next question is actually, what do you see as the biggest opportunity for Matillion in the next few years?
What I'm excited to see is how we can pivot beyond just what we have today in Data Productivity Cloud, which is the designer, where it's pretty much a very low-code experience. There's a lot of the foundational pieces that we put in place in the platform where it's enabling customers to basically do direct API calls. It's enabling customers to do direct, managing their pipelines as code, essentially. So a bit more like the infrastructure as code sort of like aspects. Where they don't really want to use a canvas. They actually just want to interact directly with the code repositories and then get their pipelines in there. So I can see us actually really growing our business out so that we target beyond just the low-code market, but also branching off to then include that high-code spectrum, which I can definitely see the opportunities from people who have teams that are actually engineering teams that are actually very savvy in terms of being able to make API calls that can actually build things that they want to automate on their side to manage the whole data ops initiatives on their end.
Great. That's a great insight. And as much as I've loved hearing you talk about the Data Productivity Cloud, I also want to get into some of the fun questions. And as you might have seen on our last few episodes, we've been doing a snack battle between US and UK snacks. So if you are watching, you would have magically seen a couple of bowls appear with some very brightly coloured snacks inside. Since the last few episodes we did something sweet, I thought we'd change it up and do some savoury snacks this time. From the US, we've got, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but Takis, I think.
Okay.
Which I think are meant to be like sour, spicy crisps. And then from the UK, we have knickknacks. I think they're the hot and spicy ones. I tried to get two, which I thought would be a little bit similar, so you can make a good comparison. So feel free to try each one and let us know your verdict.
Okay. I'm going to reach for the far bowl and...
So this is the Takis, the American crisp.
It's very tomatoey. Oh,
Okay.
wait, the spice is kicking in. Okay.
Do you like
That's
that or?
not bad, actually.
Okay.
The heat does come after.
Is it unbearable heat or is it?
No,
Okay.
it's bearable for me.
Okay.
But other people might find it a little bit too hot for them.
What would you rate that one out of 10?
It's actually not bad. I would say it's 8 out of 10.
That's a
for
solid
that one.
score. Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty good, actually. I'm quite surprised compared to the very bright artificially color. Okay, try the
That's
knickknacks now.
Yeah, hot and spicy knickknack.
It's not as spicy, but I think the balance is better for this one.
Okay.
Having had this now,
What would you rate the knickknacks?
that's a 9 out of 10. I'm now
9 out of
thinking
10?
of downgrading that to 7 now because the...
See, I thought that was going to be a clear winner with the Takis because that's probably a higher score we've had for an American snack so far.
Yeah, it's pretty good though. It is pretty decent, but I think the balance on this one's better. But also, I'm quite partial to prawn cocktails, so this has a bit of that prawn cocktail knack to it, but it's not actually spicy compared to the other one. So if you're looking for something spicier, then the Takis is better.
I love that. I think that's the most detailed food review we've had on this so far. So, thank you, Meng. So another point for the UK team. Well done. Well, I hope you enjoyed that snack, Meng. But I wanted to ask you a question, which you might have heard on both of our last episodes, because my idea is after we finish this whole series, we can put together all the songs or artists in one playlist and we can have a nice Matillion Meets Spotify playlist for everyone to listen to. So my question to you is, if you were going to host your own music festival, who would your top 3 headliners be?
That's a really tough question for me because my music genre taste is so eclectic. It is so widespread. Like I can do classical, jazz, everything. Korean hip hop recently is my thing, or K-pop rather.
Oh yeah.
So it is very widespread. But does it have to include people who are still alive, essentially?
I'd say dead or alive.
Dead or alive.
Yeah.
Bowie.
Okay.
But Bowie is definitely in there in terms of the top 3 list. But actually, here's one that might actually play quite well to some of the fans of what we call shoegazing genre.
Shoegazing.
Yeah, My Bloody Valentine.
Oh, okay. I don't think I've ever listened to them, but I've heard of them.
It is pretty good music, but you have to listen through the distortion and sounds and things like that. So My Bloody Valentine, Bowie. Who's the third one that I would put in there? I'm going to go a little bit more grungy with PJ Harvey.
Okay. I have no clue who that is, but maybe I can give him, is it him, a listen?
No, her. Yeah.
Oh, a girl. Okay.
Yeah. PJ Harvey's pretty darn good. She's done some stunning stuff.
And my next question is, what is your ultimate bucket list item?
Oh, that is a challenging one because the one thing I do love is travel and nature, and I would love to go see the gorillas.
Okay. The band
basically.
or the...
No, not the band. I'm actually a pretty decent band as well, but I would love to have had the opportunity to go into the jungle to go see the gorillas, and there's something quite fascinating about them as a primate because coming from Malaysia, I have been to Borneo and I have seen the orangutans. And I've just seen the one orangutan right away in the course of a few days. And it was quite stunning seeing nature in front of you, raw as it is, in terms of it's not caged animals, it's not in a sanctuary or anything like that. It's actually out there in the wild. Yeah. And it was this one female orangutan that was building a nest. She crossed the road in front of me one time and I was just stunned and just stood there watching it cross the road and trying to do the respectful distance thing. I saw her basically pulling fruit from the trees the next morning, and even though it's just the one that I saw because they are solitary creatures, it was still a stunning experience, and gorillas is definitely on my bucket list.
Yeah, I mean, I get amazed when I see a cow in a field, so I can imagine seeing an orangutan in the wild is quite impressive. Thank you. And lastly, before I let you go, if you could meet anyone, dead or alive, to meet with for 30 minutes, since you're on the Matillion Meets podcast, who would that be and why?
If I could meet anyone dead or alive, oh,
This is another hard one, I think.
this is a hard one because do I want to pick a writer in a way? I'm actually quite fascinated with how some of these authors come up with like concepts so early in their careers. Mary Shelley would be a fascinating one because as someone who's married to like a romantic poet, you wouldn't think of her as being able to come up with a story like Frankenstein. And there's something quite sci-fi and very ahead of its time for it. And I would like to basically, figure out where did she come up with these ideas from, because and from where did she get the inspiration from with whatever limited environment that she had at the time, or limited technology that we had in those days. So that for me is tremendously fascinating. It's always like looking at how did we get to the point where man created textiles, fabric, how did they know to turn cotton into fabric? That's the sort of stuff that fascinates me in terms of how did people come up with ideas like that.
Yeah, you're very inquisitive, aren't you?
I think it helps with the engineering background in a sense.
Thanks, Meng. It's been great speaking with you today, obviously talking about your experiences of being a female leader and also leading the team in developing the Data Productivity Cloud. But thank you for being our next guest on Matillion Meets Podcast. Please join us next time to see who Matillion will be meeting next.
Thank you so much for your time, Euros. Really appreciate the conversation. It's been really lovely.